thanks, Michael, for the introduction. I think the feeling is mutual in terms of influence and appreciation. And also thanks to Endeared and the Architecture School for the invitation. Michael was showing me around a little bit earlier, and I'm familiar with some of the history of the school, but maybe was not so familiar with some of the history embedded literally in the walls of the school that we were looking at. So it's really great to be here. I'm a fan of the school, and so to be able to come and talk really means a lot. Thank you for giving up a few hours on Friday night, only like 3 or 4, to listen to me talk. So the talk tonight is divided into 3 main parts. Really, the concentration will be on the last of this triptych. But I'll begin by giving a kind of, maybe just to introduce a few protagonists of mine that come from history, but not necessarily architectural history, followed by a kind of bit of a rumination on the namesake of the talk, about what I call darlings and what that means for me. And then a series of 9 projects that have all been produced in the office over the last 3 years, so relatively recent sampling of work. By means of introduction, I'll start with 3 protagonists, the first being Buster Keaton's film 1 Week, or maybe more specifically the house built in Buster Keaton's film 1 Week, which for me has always been sort of emblematic of how I prefer to think about architecture, to the extent that we recognize this as a house, it's legible as a house, and yet we also discern that its composition of elements and parts is either done in an unskillful or an unintentional way. And so, for me, this produces a quality of almost familiarity, and this quality of almost familiarity, for me, produces or elicits things like curiosity, delight, confusion, and so forth about the social, cultural, political, architectural, experiential circumstances around whatever we're looking at. And for me, that happens through typological manipulations and part-to-part and part-to-whole relationships. The second protagonist for me would be the sort of unnameable, non-canonical architecture found at the margins of the discipline, which tend to elicit what I call disciplinary whimsy, or something where with knowledge of the discipline you can apply or abstract or extract from it certain knowledge. However, it also has a kind of whimsical effect in that it produces plural readings. It doesn't have any fixed messages to it, but rather it conjures multiple associations. And the third protagonist for the work that I'll show would be Louis Mondit's drawings called Some Penetrations of Solids, which correspond nicely to my affinity for primitive geometries. What I like about Mondit's drawings is they introduce architectural problems of projection and figuration, but more specifically, we can look at them and we can only name them in their parts. So if you look at figure 210, you might say it's 2 cylinders, one that's askew and one cone, but if we try to name the whole, we can't do it. We can only say that it has associations like it has antennas or something like that. So the visual oscillation between parts and wholes, I would say, is the third kind of protagonist. Earlier work of mine, I'll show 2 slides that fall outside of the 3-year window. This is the first, which took those on in a sort of literal way about aggregation of and compound figures through a kind of direct rereading of Mondit, and then thinking about what were really sort of surface deformation techniques about the threshold of legibility, and producing sort of anamorphic qualities where you read distended bellies and torquing torsos and things like this to sort of suss out at what point a sphere no longer becomes sphere but becomes spherical and so forth. So with that as a kind of introduction, or maybe the protagonist to the work, it really manifests for me in 2 ways in the office and then very directly in the courses that I teach as well. With regard to the practice, it manifests in a kind of ongoing research project that looks at history, and then of course directly in the design work of the office. I'm going to dwell for maybe 10 or 15 slides on the namesake of the talk, which is called darlings, which for me is used as a term to encapsulate a kind of theorization or a reconceptualization of architectural typology that prioritizes parts rather than wholes. Maybe I apologize for the reading, there's not a lot, but for the sake of brevity, I would say that there are certain architectural forms and elements that are beloved by both architects and by broader cultures alike. These are what I call darlings. They exhibit both disciplinary and extradisciplinary endearment. So I think that they are extradisciplinary endeared by their evidencing in things like planning and preservation code, and I think that they are disciplinarily endeared, evidenced by their continual revisitation and reimagination by successive generations of architects, and that these elucidate relationships between broader culture and architectural expression, but also the production of architectural knowledge. So some of our darlings, I claim, would be things like gable roofs, chimneys, colonnades, porches, turrets, domes, or small form types that are always encountered as a part within a whole, maybe except for the domes. But otherwise they're encountered as a part within the whole, and that they really focus formal, spatial, material, and character-defining expressions. That is in contradiction to how we typically think of architectural typology, which I call the brutes, not as a form of derision, but simply that they're just more sort of massive in their obligations to program and their kind of type legibility or their type function legibility. So you look at a school and you recognize it as a school and so forth. I would say that probably the distinctions between these, for me, at their origins lie in around the mid-1700s and the early work of De Quincey and Boffron and Blondel about character and typology. And so the kind of dividing line here splits somewhere around that time. This is an excerpt of an ongoing list. This is a small sample of that collection that looks at these different small form types, with part of the point being to dispel the legacy of division in architecture, or maybe to suspend the idea of a genre speciation and also generational speciation, and instead look for alternative corollaries and connections and affinities that are cross-genre and they are cross-generational, so that we actually find relationships between architects that otherwise have very different ideologies, formal agendas, representational affinities, and so forth. So, for example, if we take something like the column, it's impossible in a lecture like this right now to try to unpack the entire history of the column. So I guess for now it'll be sufficient to say that it's through successive generations of architects, sculptors, craftsmen, technological advancements, and so forth that we find the column is a site of continual reimagination, a site for continual architectural and cultural expression. But while we might say that, on one hand, it's not quite so simple to say that it's a sort of just only a form of expression necessarily, but actually that what the column, like all of the darlings, is my argument, actually have a dramatic impact on the programmatic types that we typically understand about typology. So if we take Corb's Maison Domino, problematizing the location of the column produced 50 plus years of debate around the corner, while also liberating things like facade and plan. And so that by working on problematizing the parts within a whole, it actually produces new architectural knowledge that is fed back into the kind of larger programmatic obligations. Jumping ahead in time, we find, and this is just a small sample of exhibition projects, that we realize there's no real shortage of attention to the column still, whether it's the sort of inversion of its conical diagram to becoming a group form by Heather Roberge, her exhibition On Point, or reimaginations of the caryatid through kind of post-digital materiality, or concentrating on ideas about fluting and what that might mean with regard to either industrial extrusion or manufacturing technologies about shade and shadow of the flutes and so forth. Similarly, we could say the same for something like the gable roof, which of course, putting these two, column and roof, in a pair here, we would eventually trace this back to something like the primitive hut. For now, I would say that one of the aspects of the darlings, if you think about something like Work AC, would be that on the one hand, the gable roof satisfies particular regulatory conditions, while at the same time helps to reinforce those regulatory conditions. And so it's not that they're just a kind of form of expression, but they actually begin to engage with the kind of politics, or at least the bureaucracy of code and planning. In other instances, we might track particular histories that have very strong signification, so something like the chimney and a signification of house, and while also constructing sort of material and geometric shifts that moving from left to right in this image move from aggregated cylinders on a kind of cubic plinth to surface deformed chimney caps to sort of postmodern extrusion, like very exuberant embellishments on the chimney, and then back to a kind of referential chimney without ever forgiving its legibility and the production of kind of houseness and what that might mean in terms of its own psychologies of house. One of the things about the Darlings, as I sort of presented them, is if they're all principal types. In fact, all of them have a sort of subtype to them. Maybe most evident would be something like the vault, where it has many subtypes, including something like the barrel vault. So something like Cahn's Kimball Art Museum produces, or it directly corresponds with a kind of linear tangential arrangement of program, whereas something like the unbuilt Wu House uses barrel vault profiles and the occasional cylinder, and sort of collided projections through one another to manipulate both where the kind of redistribution of organization and plan, as well as the plan elevation, and then something like the vault house, where there's a very immediate direct correspondence between the vault and the volume. So these become important for me in a range of conversations, in that they sort of remix or reshuffle some of what we understand to be these deeply rooted histories, while resurrecting sort of past speculations, some of which are canonical, some of which are not. But maybe more than anything, that because they become the character-defining features, they also have the potential or the capacity to shift the arc of political and social and cultural, as well as architectural attention. And so that, for me, is the kind of relationship between the elucidation of both knowledge and architecture and this sort of extradisciplinary or outside of the discipline endearment, as I call it. One of the things that's important to me in these two, Michael and I were part of a conversation last night that questioned the idea of precedent in history. I think for me, I'm deeply interested in the received histories, which may or may not be about architecture, that those received histories participate in the sort of imagination of the discipline. I'm going to turn now to a collection of 9 projects. This will be the bulk of the talk. These are all projects from the last 3 years. The work of the office really divides into these 3 categories: typological legacy, codes and cultural endearment, and contextual industries. Not all of the work, in fact, actually most of the work that I'm showing is unbuilt work. Some of it was initiated from client projects. Some of it I'll conclude with a constructed project, but also others of it are just a sort of ongoing, maybe self-interest project about architecture. In the first category of typological legacy, I'm mostly interested again in those received histories and the sort of reconsiderations of those histories and the traditions and maybe possible imaginations that use known types and their formal and spatial identities to sort of recast those with, again, a particular emphasis on the Darlings and our protagonists from the beginning. So this is a project, the oldest project in the talk, that was completed for the Architectural Lead Prize in 2015, and was really concentrating a lot on Mondit, Louis Mondit's drawings, some penetrations of solids. And I was interested in their relationship to redescribing things we know from the canon of history, in particular with a concentration on domes. So something like San Carlo, where if we look at the plan on the left, we read segmentations and niches and differentiations of parts. And when we look at the image on the right, beautiful as it is, and there's a whole other conversation we can have about this project, of course. For now, I'll simply just call attention to the kind of fidelity between the drawing and the built image, or the constructed volume, and that there's not a lot of contrast between the two, especially now knowing what we know of projection and so forth. we can imagine the construct out of the plan. So I was interested in sort of reimagining these canonical domes. So you can see in this drawing that San Carlo is redrawn in red. Now, it's not an exact redrawing, it's a diagrammatic redrawing, but it's one that retains enough fidelity to the original to be recognized as such. And then the kind of resultant plan of a dome that I proposed, drawn in black, where using only spheres, cones, and cylinders overlaid on San Carlo's dome, with some manipulations in the z dimension, you arrive at a kind of figure where you have no sort of direct correspondence between plan and figure, and where things like niches and differentiation of parts and so forth are absorbed into a form where you might look at it and say, I see a cone, but you can't actually ever distinguish a part from the whole. You can only draw associations. Most often, that it looks like a chicken leg, which I say somewhat glowingly, actually. The second of the four, I'm not going to show all four, I'm just going to give two as a sort of evidence of the other two, is Philip Johnson's Roofless Church. You can see it's a centralized plan on the left with 7 circles, 6 of which arrayed around a center circle. More peculiar to me in this dome is if you look in the image on the right at the middle of the dome, you find a plinth and a statue, and that's a very strange thing to do to me in a centralized plan of a dome, in particular a dome that has an oculus, where really the whole point is to occupy the center of the dome and be sort of directly below the eye. So the occlusion of that experience makes it a kind of centrifugal plan that pushes makes a centralized plan into centrifugal that pushes the experience to the exterior. So again, the plan copy of Johnson's is drawn in red. My version is drawn in black. It doesn't look very extreme, at least compared to San Carlo, where I'm really only varying the diameter of the circles. And so in that variation, it moves it from a polar array to almost a biaxial symmetry. And when seen frontally here, because I'm not projecting the curve through the circle through a hyperbolic curve becomes more taut. And you can also see the hill at the middle. All of the domes have hills, which is a response to Johnson's inclusion of the two-dimensional center. The hill would move, if built in real scale, would move one at an average height to your head being at the centroid, so it kind of occupies the three-dimensional center of the dome, as opposed to the kind of flatness of the two-dimensional center. And then the effect of the variable-sized circles is registered most heavily in the shingle coursing. So the shingle coursing has to sort of modulate and adjust to the different diameters, producing this kind of wiggling or sort of unstable effect of the dome. So here you can see all four. The other two that I'm not showing, the patinated and the striped one, play those same kind of plan games in the reconstruction in a Louis Mondet-inspired way out of canonical domes. I'm going to show 4 house projects tonight, 5 that are currently designed, and which will eventually become a series of 10, called the Thenhaus series. They don't go in sequential order. I start with number 1, and then I go to 4, and then I think 2 and 3. The first one is a mountain cabin, and I think when you think of a mountain cabin, probably it already conjures something in your mind, something of a timber frame and deep eaves and a steep gable roof and a porch and so forth. This is sort of this is just what came up on Google, just to sort of verify that this seems to be a kind of popular imagination. But then there is also a kind of mystique about the American cabin. This is an image from a negative political campaign ad from the 1800s that portrayed William Henry Harrison as unworthy of presidential candidacy because he lived in a cabin. It's a very soft sort of political attack by today's standards. But also, this is a bit linear in a way, but the barrels of hard cider that occlude the corner became a bit of a fascination, as well as that kind of received history of the cabin. The cabin changed because of this ad. This political ad actually sparked the Harrison campaign, used it as a way to actually say that this is the new American spirit. It's about independence, it's about self-sustenance and so forth. And he actually won the presidency. He then caught pneumonia and died before he finished the 30th day of his presidency. But anyway, so it comes with this kind of mystique, this mystique about living in the landscape and so forth. So returning to some of the darlings, I was interested both in the barrel, but then the barrel vault, the bay window, and the scupper, which is not a darling, but its functional purpose is useful here. And treating them almost in a binary, so the barrel vault inverts to become a kind of negative form, the bay window inverts to exert inward pressure, and the scupper elongates to sort of consume the entirety of the roof. So here you see highlighted in copper would be the inverted barrel vault and the elongated scupper. Perhaps more important to this project is the series of barrel vaults at the base of the cabin that as they carve away, they sort of disrupt typical understanding of cabin to ground and offer new spatial and formal possibilities. Namely, which is that it sort of undertucks the porch. So it removes the obligation for a front porch, and almost in a kind of Palladian villa or this kind of villa rotunda way, no matter which way you enter from, you sort of arrive somehow almost at the center. Though in this case you're underneath of the project. So while sort of fostering this more continuous relationship with the landscape. And so here you see the kind of de-obviation of the front porch, the removal of kind of explicit frontality, which will be a continued theme in almost every project that I'll show, as is the site of the front porch as a means for manipulation. Though each facade has a kind of different hierarchy to it and a different formal composition, it doesn't immediately disclose a kind of idea about frontality. So this particular project in terms of typological legacy is in contrast, I would say, to the domes. The domes are much more about geometric aggregation, primitive form aggregation, and compound figures. This has more of Manderist tendencies about elongation and exaggeration and sort of manipulation to known elements, and maybe less to do with aggregation. Those two tendencies will reveal themselves in all of the projects, though I won't point them out explicitly from here out. The second of the what is currently 5 houses is the farmhouse. I find farmhouses a bit tricky as a type. I can't think of another domestic type that's encountered across such a wide range of psychological and representational dramas as the farmhouse. They often remind of the hardships endured by rural living while simultaneously conjuring ideas about a kind of simpler time or a time gone by. We see this in comparisons of a kind of fictional family, the Waltons of the 1970, of this sort of endearing time gone by family, juxtaposed by the utter environmental and social decay of the 1930s Dust Bowl. Now, of course, both of these are long past. I don't know that they are particularly material anymore, but they certainly seem to be sort of habituated in the public imaginary of the farmhouse. Maybe just to add to this, it becomes a bit more complicated because I think that the farmhouse equally represents the allure of the sublime and the sort of anxiety of the horrific. So something like The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy is dreamily upended by this act of nature, and it sort of disrupts or undoes the tight-knit familial structure of the farmhouse, and only to return her in this sort of enlightened state after this sort of enchanted voyage and so forth, juxtaposed by Hitchcock's repeated use of the farmhouse, in this case an Italian farmhouse, as a site of intrinsic fear, a site which sort of represents the ruptured, almost uncanny familial space of horror and fright and anxiety. My suspicion, or at least my claim, is that this has something to do with what's known as purlieu, which is, I think it's a Middle English term used to describe land that is partially cultivated, but also partially wild. And it becomes this kind of liminal space between a space of comfort and a space of maybe discomfort. You see this in a lot of movies where kids break at the threshold of moving into the forest, for example. And then when they come out of the forest, it appears safe again. And you find that in a lot of literary and cinematic enterprises. I think with regard to the farmhouse, it begins to, I think, suggest an idea that For those accustomed to its nearness, it becomes a space of enlightenment and enchantment and so forth, as Dorothy found. But for those at a remove, it becomes a site of sort of intrinsic fear, or a space of too much mystery, is what Hitchcock plays on. I promise that there's a project in here in a minute. But one more thing about the farmhouse that I find really odd or sort of difficult to work on is a spatial and contextual contradiction. Almost always a farmhouse will exhibit frontality. There's a relationship of its front porch and the visibility of its door from either the access road or the driveway. And I find this strange, sort of maybe boringly strange, because it's a architectural type under no pressure of address. It has no pressure of public address. It's a quintessential object in the round. And so I find that it exhibits frontality odd. It gets even more odd because in a traditional farmhouse you enter the front door through the porch, which is a utilitarian space for disrobing and de-shoeing after labor, and you enter into the most formal space of the house, which is the parlor room, which is almost very rarely used. It's only used for weddings and funerals and so forth. So anyway, these kind of psychological and representational dramas that characterize the farmhouse in its spatial contextual contradiction are of interest to me, where in Thenhaus number 4, there is an attitude about sort of recasting these dramas, really by unhinging the farmhouse from its, what I call, strange obligation to frontality, specifically through manipulations to things like the porch and the facade and its internal organization. So when seen frontally, sheared corners appear, or chamfered corners maybe, appear to produce a kind of receding flatness, as particular elements like windows remain sort of oriented one way. The chamfered corners indicate an orientation towards another. When we look at the facade, the driveway, rather than stopping at the porch, continues through the house in that little hole. On the left, curtains temporarily occlude portions of the front facade, or the facade as a sort of riff on or a reimagination of the wraparound porch. And then maybe most specifically the elements, the sort of indication of a gambrel roof hybridized with an exaggerated sort of chimney form, intends to draw on the kind of typological influences notable in farmhouses and barns to approach that kind of almost familiar quality. When seen in plan, rather than the front to back ordering from porch to parlor to living to bathroom to kitchen, here the kind of inversion of that to a side entry enters one to a hall that has these kinds of vestigial rooms that encrust the inside liner of the house and produce these kinds of rooms within rooms of varying scales and materials. And you can see the driveway there actually splitting or dividing house from barn. And really it's on any approach, no matter which way you sort of orient yourself to the house, there's always a face that sort of orients towards you and an element that orients away from you. So it tries to activate itself as a kind of object in the round, rather than the kind of explicit attitude towards frontality. The last project in this category is the San Francisco Music Hall. Music halls are typically what I would consider programmatically bottom-heavy, meaning that they tend to produce a figure ground plan that has a robust figure or shape to it, and which clearly delineates inside from outside. I was interested in disrupting some of those inheritances of the music hall. So here you can see, maybe I'll just note quickly, a return to Mondit and the aggregation problem of, in this case, 9 cylinders and 16 cones atop them, where these kind of Gothic-like arches are cut through them that produce these visual and spatial layers, where in plan, rather than a kind of robust or clean figured ground plan that is notable to a music hall, here you get kind of a confetti-like plan that acts to suspend or prolong the idea of the threshold as you move through the colonnade pieces, under the building, then through. So here as you begin to move under. And so the project also sort of draws influence from its context, where in Golden Gate Park, the fog, so the kind of botanical and geographic and climatic effects also produce these different visual and spatial layerings that the project intends to sort of advance, so producing these sort of receding depths of shadows, and really looking at sort of disruption of legibility between the distinction of silhouette and mass, front and back, object and field, inside, outside, and so forth. More here as you begin to approach, you begin to move through the park landscape under the kind of first of these colonnade veils, and then as you move through the project, they continue in plan and section, really through these kind of episodic staircases and circulation sequences. So these are some photographs of the model currently at an exhibition at Yale, where again here you can see there's an attitude about frontality. It's 2.5 cubes, 2 of them filleted together, and then just nine cylinders and 16 cones. But in no way does it ever sort of disclose itself in terms of having a front, which again is a response to its kind of in the round qualities of Golden Gate Park. Okay, the second category, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here for codes and cultural endearment. This work really began when I arrived in San Francisco, and almost immediately after arriving, I met a couple who had just bought a house, and they hired me to do a renovation for them and an addition, and I was naturally very excited about this. And it turns out that the house was actually built to be non-compliant, so it's 2 feet in the side yard. The previous owner had put in a bathroom and a bedroom in the garage. There's all kinds of problems with it. So at the end of the day, we were limited to only build 44 square feet. So designed a sort of 44 square foot entry tower. The costs of construction and so forth, it just is cost prohibitive to do this. It would have been absurd to actually build the project. So they bailed. And I think instead they bought like a new rug for the dining room. But nevertheless, it sparked an interest in the kind of code regulations of the Bay Area and of San Francisco City. And so shortly after that project, I was approached to do an exhibition at a gallery in Los Angeles called the John Jai Gallery. And I thought it would be at least interesting to explore the topic of code in a way that dealt with San Francisco preservation. Maybe not as an upholding of it, but as a sort of first approach at critiquing it. And I noted that almost exclusively what I call darlings, the city of San Francisco calls the character-defining features. It figures exclusively and prominently in the San Francisco Code to the extent that they, well, I'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, but everything that I outlined as a darling exactly corresponds with almost everything in the San Francisco Code that's regulated as preservation. So I just moved there from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I became just totally fascinated by these incredibly weird corners. I found them weird, again, maybe sort of boringly weird, that to put a cylindrical, goiter-like, bloated thing on a square house seemed very odd to me. It sort of was like, here's a corner problem that I care about. Maybe not the re-entrant corner of column and arch from the Renaissance and the problem of the detailed perpendicular planes from modernism, but instead something that was like deeply spatial, sort of already odd, and frankly was very Louis Mondit, putting primitive geometries together, and even introducing some of the complexities about the construction of that, which you can see is not very easy, or in that case anyway. So it's also interesting to me because these things became modifiers of difference. Of course, these are towers, not turrets, but that by relating the turret or the tower to the roof became a way to introduce difference to things that are otherwise the same. So, which is to say that I realized that the corner is not a fixed condition of the wall, but actually by introducing the turret or the tower, the corner becomes sort of variable in its location, and its relationship is studied through how it relates to the roof. So on the left, it's aligned. On the right, it's pushed back from the gable, and that sets in motion a range of both formal readings as well as spatial possibilities of the interior. And so I went about cataloging hundreds of these, and they're in no short supply in San Francisco. And I encountered some that were sort of conventional and normal, and then I encountered some like this, which is one of my favorites because I just don't know how we describe this in the lexicon of architecture. The tower is literally bigger than the house. And they loved it so much that they put another one as a cupola on top. And so you quickly realize like these things are so deeply endeared to Bay Area culture. And by the way, this is also true, there are codes in New York that have this ingrained, as well as in Chicago and Atlanta, and it's a whole project that I'm working on. But this is interesting. They're so beloved that it doesn't matter that the house looks sort of quote-unquote ridiculous. It has a tower, and therefore it's kind of sign of participating in Bay Area culture. So I went about the process of sort of redrawing all of the existing conditions which you see on the left that were encountered in the city, and a sort of mannered version of mine on the right, where here fascia boards sweep across the facade, which calls into question the nature of the corner. Where does the corner start and stop? But also introduces a problem of geometry of the roof, where you start to begin to hybridize the little gablet with the witch's cap to reveal this almost sort of really strange mansard roof, or in other cases questioning the relationship again of the corner. So on the left-hand side, I would argue that that's a compound figure because the turret bottom attenuates to the corner of the house. I was interested in kind of autonomous formalism, not in an Eisenman sense, but in turret to house sense. So the legs of the turret sort of spread away, revealing itself as a kind of its own context, also evidenced by the shift of the window up, which of course dislocates our reading of floor. I won't go through all these, there's a bunch of them, merging elements together, like combining a chimney with the turret and so forth, or looking at conventional details on the left of a flare detail, and imagining that it got sort of sufficiently old, that it lost its tautness and became what I call the flab detail on the right. And then for the gallery, constructed 3 turrets at 3/4 size, the tallest one's about just under 12 feet tall, where they adopt different spatial material qualities that are learned from the code. So the sort of patinated fat roll turret presumably would be a permissible turret. The one with the shingles uses the 6 shingle patterns permitted by code for preservation, with manipulating 1 to have an extruded or a distended tip. And then they're put in a kind of 8-step repeating coursing pattern, and then the one with the kind of split legs. But also that the turret could convene new, or maybe just alternative responses to it. So the fat roll turret that looks patinated and old is soft and squishy. The shingle turret sort of animates in the wind, or as people sort of flick it or jiggle it, the shingles sort of animate themselves. With the idea that then the gallery became a kind of scene in itself, so that you move between and around the turrets as if they're kind of themselves like the context, so to speak. And you can see in the background, the painted houses are the painted 20 versions of the different turret relationships to roof that were encountered in San Francisco, repainted on the walls of the gallery. So about a year, I think that this show is coming in its 2nd iteration to here in January, I think, drawing codes. So drawing codes version 2 will come here in January. I was part of drawing codes 1, which some colleagues of mine at CCA asked people to produce a drawing that was about code, with the implied intention that it was more about maybe digital code or coding or something like that. I interpret it to be more about planning and preservation code. So I began looking at this house, which is the Haas-Lilienthal house in San Francisco. This is one of the cornerstone houses of the preservation code. Not included in the preservation code is the architect's quote for what he imagined of the house, which is that it should represent every known and unknown order of architecture. It should be so heavily plastered with ornament that it conceals its theory of construction. It should be a restless, uncertain, frightful collection of details, giving the effect of a nightmare about to explode. It's one of my favorite quotes describing architecture that I've read ever, including Mies and Korb. So I wanted to sort of take his idea of the house and cast it into a relationship of what it had done in the Planning and Preservation Code of San Francisco, which had become very limiting and conservative. So I did a redrawing of the Haas-Lilienthal house. I abided almost by the rule set out for us, which is that it could be no perspective, so there's 3 different orthographic projections included, which is why you get the weird ground line. There's two parts that are in perspective, so I couldn't resist breaking one of their rules for the show. But it takes on the kind of attitude of Peter Schmidt and his idea about Victorian architecture, and it sort of critiques the code in a way where you find things like sad gargoyles atop rubble stairs. You find another version of a fat roll turret, lamps on the porch, sort of incorrect dormers that are in contrast to the code, and so forth. And this sort of builds into a larger narrative of the Victorian architecture in San Francisco. I don't really want to give the idea that it's all just sort of whimsy, because it actually has a very strange sort of culture inversion in its history. So in the 1960s through the 1980s, the Victorian houses were incredibly cheap to rent. Of course, today they're the most expensive properties to rent or buy in San Francisco. But because they were cheap in the 60s and 70s, they really became the kind of backdrop of San Francisco counterculture, to the extent that this is the Coquettes, who, if you know, they're a kind of psychedelic theater group, a drag theater group, who did performances both in their Oak Street home and in theaters around San Francisco. Or you find on the left here an image of the Grateful Dead, where they lived in that house for 3 years. It's the house that the famous drug bust of 1967 took place. They're there with the Eagles and so forth, or Janis Joplin, and the kind of the idea that the Victorian houses are preserved as an aesthetic becomes odd when you remember the kind of countercultural histories. So here is the Grateful Dead house, and then on the right is Charles Manson. Of course, he's not a musical artist. But the point I'm trying to make is that they drew very different associations to culture in the 60s, 70s, and 80s than they do now, even to the extent that during the gay rights movement, the color that we associate now with the Victorian houses of San Francisco in postcards and kitsch memorabilia and so forth, in the trinket shops around the city, were the result of a form of self-expression for equal rights in the gay culture of San Francisco of that time. And so, but it becomes really strange because the code then does something like this. We're now in 2018. It limits the color palette to just a select number of colors depending on whatever district you're in. And so all of a sudden you start to realize that there's a really strange relationship between what the code is quote-unquote preserving, which seems to have nothing to do with the kind of cultural transformation or social transformation or kind of political unrest at the time, and instead it starts to bracket a particular kind of aesthetic image, where everything from turret shapes and bay window sizes and so forth are regulated. This is not something that's totally unique to San Francisco. What's unique to San Francisco is the kind of countercultural movement becoming a very conservative planning code and preservation code. So everything from porches and balconies and so forth. But what you find also is that the regulations become increasingly superficial, meaning that they are really only front facade regulations. It's a front facade city, so you encounter houses like this. This is a series of drawings I've been producing called the as-builts, which is a term appropriated from the labor of a contractor, where a house burned down and it revealed this side of the house, and you start to understand a very different compositional attitude about elements that imply certain interior spatialities that are very, very distinct from the front facade planning and preservation regulations, where here you find highly illegal and in fact highly unsafe additions built on the back of houses that fall outside of the preservation code, or things like the kind of commitments to the regulation of the interior through electricity and so forth, as they start to aggregate on sort of quote-unquote invisible side of the house. So I was interested in taking all of that stuff with the planning and preservation code that's limiting and trying to identify a sort of ideal plan, or maybe what I would just call the average plan, not even typical, just an average plan of the code. So by taking the planning and preservation code diagrams and plan and recomposing them into this image of a plan for a house, it's something that would be permissible in any district or any neighborhood in San Francisco. And then I won't walk you through this, but there are some tendencies in the Thenhouses where there's sort of vestigial rooms that peel from the exterior wall. In this case, some of them sort of detach and become these sort of island-like rooms within rooms within rooms. maybe more importantly, is the sort of intentional manipulations to things in the elevations. So here in the front elevation, which to my knowledge would be a permissible elevation, or thinking about, again, kind of some of the relationship between parts, in this case the window and the turret, and doing some things that are quintessentially wrong. So you really will never find a flat, smooth surface in a Queen Anne home. If you do, it's not a Queen Anne home, so sort of questioning the logic of how they're defining or limiting certain house types, and then thinking about the manipulation to certain things like dormers, balconies, and so forth, where, again, you start to, in this case, maybe referring back to the mountain cabin, you read a sort of, one way of reading would be an inverted bay window, asymmetrical bay window, which is really just the inverted form of the protruding balcony and dormer, but kind of, again, a way to sort of think about the way that the Darlings can reimagine and reconstruct other possible formal and spatial identities. And the last project I'm going to show, it's funny because most of the actual client work, I'm only showing one of the current projects. There's a warehouse project that I'm not showing that has to do, like, these scale up. And they have to do a lot with what I call contextual industries, meaning that there are certain zoning regulations and stuff like that that start to produce a neighborhood of particular uses. In this case, I'm referring to where I currently teach, which is at San Francisco at California College of the Arts, where a year and a half ago or so, the current dean at that time, Jonathan Massey, had asked me to do an exhibition design for an exhibition he was curating on this 2.5-acre backlot, as is known, where Jeannie Gang is now going to be building a new building back there. But this is the condition of it. It's highly variegated in its use and in its color, and it functions as a kind of work yard for students, as well as everything to like NAB accreditation for the architecture school. In the trailers, there's a material reuse center, a welding center, and so forth. So, and it's also positioned in this kind of light industrial warehouse neighborhood. It's a very sort of peripheral urban campus. And so, given the nature of the backlot already, I really could not imagine a sort of overriding, unifying idea about how to organize everything. Also noting that the incoming 5 pavilions that were curated for the show were vastly different, in my opinion, about how to sort of position them next to each other. So I sort of began with a rewriting or a redefinition of confetti, because when I looked at the backlot images, it just felt like confetti. So I sort of rewrote confetti as a way to think about an organizing principle that was loose and informal, but which it could easily accommodate change. It could accommodate new material additions. It could accommodate subtractions, which was good because one of the pavilions wasn't finished on time. It was also good because now they've added 2 new trailers to the backlot. So it became this kind of flexible way of producing these different organizations where by reorganizing the trailers as the most kind of grid-like structure, which are in the orange blocks, it produces these episodic views from the perimeter of the site. So you start to get these kinds of view corridors through and across the site that frame views of the pavilions. So here you see another image of the model. This is really the one process image I'm showing, which is the templating of the site. And then you can see here the kind of finished painted version before the pavilions went in, where the different splines and the arcs and the circles all indicate particular ways to sit, to move, to look, and so forth. So the green splines indicate where to walk through. The yellow, bright yellow circles are the kind of Kodak moment that are framing a particular pavilion in the kind of urban landscape. Guy's shadow looks like modular a little bit, so I like this. I like this slide. So you can see the kind of temporality of the backlot becomes both a social space, becomes a work yard. It's a space for displaying the prototypes and so forth, while maintaining the functions of the institution and the obligations it has to, its own operative mode. And you can see in the context of this, the idea was to sort of reauthor this light industrial, kind of low context of all these very large warehouses that Reed is really gray. You may have seen in one of those images there's a highway, so you can see, you really have a look down, you do look down on this site quite a bit from the highway to sort of re-author the image of this lower Potrero Hill neighborhood. That's what I have. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Sure.
Or insults or... if there are.
Well, I have a couple questions to maybe start with. One thing that I found curiously absent from your descriptions was the strange materiality that creeps through all the projects in different ways. Just maybe if you could say something about your attitude towards material, textural articulations.
I mean, it depends on the project in some way. I would say, for example, with the Victorian house, and in others, you note things like faux fur in plan and in elevation. For me, that's a bit of a reclaiming of some of the sort of effects of drag that that were introduced to the kind of Victoriana culture of San Francisco through like the coquettes and stuff like that. It's also a way maybe to reclaim ideas about clutter. And in particular with the Victorians, because their interiors were often very cluttered. They collected tchotchkes and things and kind of kitsch items. So there was an idea of replacing, at least as an architect, of replacing the kind of found objects that they might acquire with something maybe already satisfying within the home. So it's also, you probably also noted that the faux fur parts in plan are typically the kind of room within a room. They're a very intimate scale. So there's a bit of an attitude there that I have about the disruption of sort of universal space and an idea that rather than universal space, that you can have these sort of pockets that are, I imagine, to be spaces for whatever, arguing, making love, having a phone conversation, the sort of domestic, the implied domestic uses that are not about anything happens in any room, but it's also, I'm being very cautious to not sound deterministic. And then with other projects, like the turrets, for example, the materiality was a learned sort of behavior out of the code and the inherited material palette of the city. So that's that was a sort of intentional manipulation. So the fat roll turret that's patinated appears old, but it's squishy. The shingles come from the shingle patterns.
First of all, thank you very much for the thickness of the lecture, and I find that somehow, if we could have had a seminar for you in the round, it might have been a better forum to extend the Q&A period, because I just find too many questions that I have, and if you just have the patience, if we could make our way through a series of discussions, I'd really appreciate it. And some of them are small details. Others are more, involved. And some of them extend Michael's question. The first one I was surprised is a very simple one. Is that when
I like those ones.
When you...
By the way, he always goes straight for a detail.
No. This one is just a conceptual one, because I was surprised by it, given the comfort you've demonstrated with a theoretical and historical realm. But when you pair up the darlings with the brutes, what I was surprised by is that you make reference to typology, but once you fall into typology, you make it a programmatic argument. And if my understanding was correct, if there's anything we inherited in the 60s and 70s about the reinvocation of typology, is that it was independent of program, because it is precisely about the morphological and the organizational aspects of type, and not the programs that inhabit them. Am I misunderstanding something in your argument, or am I misunderstanding something about the revocation of type?
Not entirely. I think that what I'm mostly arguing is it's about a type function legibility, so that school looks as a school, library looks as a library, and part of the interest I have is in the parts that do that. So whether it's a chimney or a bay window or a turret, that they also construct their own genealogical history. So they have their own sort of like the translation of a turret of a military thing to a Victorian house. I find odd, and I'm interested in that history. Whereas.
So do I understand correctly that your preoccupation is semantic and iconographic in great part in the first instance, and then apparently by the end of the lecture you get deep into the spatial and morphological implications it has on the plans and the sections?
I think that's correct, yeah.
So you managed also in a very deft way to get through the entire lecture without making any challenge to nor an explicit respect to complexity and contradiction, and yet somehow it's lurking in the background. And is there any interest you have in that conversation?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested in that conversation. I think that, in particular, I sort of withhold that a little bit right now as part of the larger issue of the 4 of the current 5 houses, which will become 10. Part of that is because it's not fully played out across that series of the houses. In terms of just the broader discussion for complexity and contradiction, what I'm not so interested in is the kind of signification necessarily. I'm interested in its history. So I showed, Venturi's Anthony Scott Brown's Beach House.
Certainly.
But I do think that there's, and also like I'm encroaching on postmodernism too, because I'm talking about the kind of, double readings, one for architects, one for, but it's, I don't think what I'm suggesting is that it's a particular language that's meant for you to read in one way and, non-architects to read in another way. Instead, I think it's approaching it more from the attitude that these things are ingrained in the kind of politics of the city already, and that by using them, and even in the way that like work AC, the example I showed there is in the roof, it both sort of adheres to, upholds the certain zoning regulations about light and view and so forth through the triptych of 3 gable roofs. And that's where I think it becomes not so much about signification in terms of the darlings and things like that, but it's actually a way to shift the arc of that attention span.
So explain to us then a shift in thinking that happens between the earlier projects and the latest. And I have my eyes fixated on one phenomenon. In the beginning, when you're talking about intersecting geometries and volumes, the operation that you perform on them is to fuse them and blur their legibility so that you can read at once their difference and sameness, so the confluence of the two. But by the time that you come to the end and you're reading the codes of San Francisco, what you're doing is you're radicalizing the differences of fragmented parts in absolute heretical dissonance without any regard to the problem of synthesis or a moment of reconciliation. And that thing that all architects in some way or another create, even artificially for themselves, as what we call constraints. Like if they don't provide codes, we do it in order to evade kitsch or to find a way to, create our own orthodoxies. And so you shift from a device that has to do with synthesis to collage. And I just want to know what is the line of, is this a trajectory or no, this is just another chapter in a range of other different operations you're going to be playing?
I'm sure it's a trajectory. I think the shift came from, I touched on it just very briefly by indicating the difference between the domes and the cabin, and the shift being from about the kind of compound figure problem to one of a kind of mannerist attitude about manipulation of elements. And I think that tendency in the more recent work of a kind of mannerist attitudes about manipulation, exaggeration, elongation, inversion, even some of them that I didn't dwell on at all in the line drawings of the turrets, borrow from kind of art history mannerism in the projection of impossible views. So in many of those, like the one that has a kind of odd mansard roof, if modeled three-dimensionally.
Yeah, but by the time you get to the end, it's not even about difficult synthesis. It's just about.
Right. Yeah, I think that what happened intentionally was that there became a moment somewhere after the domes where the engagement with the rules of the city were in such discordance with the attitude about compound figures that I was exploring with spheres, cones, and cylinders, that it was no longer particularly feasible as a mode of critique of the things that were the rules of the city. What was able to become a mode of critique was the manipulation to those rules. So understanding the planning and preservation code was one way of doing that, but it required a bit of a... I mean, I read the projects as much of a... this is going to get slippery, but it's almost like there's a syntax, said carefully, of a rereading of the code, so that you could actually rewrite the code as a version of the manipulated form, which just wasn't possible with the compound figure problem that I was previously working on. So the shift was a sort of attitude about mannerism, and I'm careful to never call it postmodernism, for a variety of reasons, I guess, but that opened up territory for me with regard to the darlings that allowed a whole new range of exploratory options through manipulation and through sort of inventing the strange, like the fat roll detail, or the manipulations to the scupper and things like that.
And I promise you, this is my last question, but you bring it up, and I have a personal affinity with this, and I have my own ways of describing it, but it's clear also that your reading of the figurative escapes the strictly architectural in the sense that, you know, things that you aptly describe in the beginning as porches and gables and bay windows and so forth, turrets and so forth, eventually end up as the anthropomorphic and the zoomorphic, and they end up in the armpit, the crotch, all of the other ambiguous pieces that are seemingly grafted into the scale of architecture. And we know, of course, that to some degree that shift in scale doesn't always happen naturally. It comes with an agenda. And sometimes it has its own technical feats in order to do that, because things at 6 feet are just not the same as 60 feet. But I wonder if you could also, and this may be more personal or it may be disciplinary, describe what is your fascination with the human body, the zoomorphic body, as a repository for this kind of research.
I think what I appreciate about it is the associative qualities, so that it opens up such a wider territory of pluralism in my mind anyway, about the associative impact of individuals. So it's an explicit move away from any sort of fixed meaning or a message to be read, which is a sort of departure of much of the postmodern, which is why I try not to even invoke that in some cases. But I think that it becomes increasingly associative in its own subjectivity, because any one person who sees it will also understand it to be somehow in relation to them. Now, it's also not this kind of existential argument about humanism or something like that. It's simply that I think it opens a territory that is pluralistic, it's associative, and I see it as a way of sort of enrolling or maybe sponsoring wider audiences' engagement with the work. If nothing else, just a visual engagement, maybe not exactly spatial or experiential, but certainly visual. So the sort of visual engagement is an inroad to a conversation, and I deeply appreciate, it's why I sort of chuckle when I'm showing the dome and people say it looks like a chicken leg, and I appreciate that it looks like a chicken leg, and yet it's a reconstruction of a Borromini canon of architecture. So I think it's just really about plural associations.
The first one is a gutter a darling?
A gutter. The thing about the darlings is I try to avoid explicit functionality. The scupper also is not a darling, which I believe I said. But I try to avoid explicit functionality, and instead I favor things that have formal and spatial A-functioning possibilities. So what I also didn't show, but maybe you remember from the gallery show in LA, there's a collection of dormers that have no windows. You can't. It doesn't make any sense to have a dormer without a window, other than to uphold some sort of cultural ideal, right? And so I guess I would say I wouldn't include the gutter as a darling, particularly because it doesn't have. It's too tied to a functional imperative.
Yeah, okay, but so you were saying that people project what they will see into it. So for the Thenhaus #1, I would see that filleted edge as a giant gutter in this way. I don't know if you could argue that, but
yeah, I mean there is absolutely the scupper becomes the kind of gutter, yes, and to the extent that it maintains its function of dispelling water. Though it's also doing it without a parapet, so it's already kind of unnecessary in a way. But it's also doing it in a way that it gets exaggerated so much that it is just the roof. And so I think that I would say I would be closer. Well, this is what I like about the darlings. Like maybe you could argue with a certain degree of manipulation that something could transgress its own function. I mean, the turret is maybe an example too. Its origins are militaristic. It was really for shooting arrows out of anybody coming from this wall of the castle or this wall, and now we build them where you can't even look out of them. So there is something about that kind of transgression or the infidelity to an intended use that is particular to the darlings, including things like bay windows and gable roofs and so forth.
Okay, and then the second question comment. It's interesting that Venturi came up because I kept thinking, is he ever going to say difficult hole? And you never did.
No.
For deliberate reasons, obviously. But I do find it interesting in terms of representation. The further along the word goes, the more difficult it becomes to understand. I don't know if it's like purposefully bad visual. Like you can't ever understand the entirety of the whole. In fact, you skewed the perspectives in sort of a Teatro Olimpico kind of way for a moment there. Or looking at the one elevation drawing, and you even made a comment that the ground line is different.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I'm reading that as you have a really cute project and really pretty drawings, but we can't talk about it in those terms. It has to be a bit more serious.
Mm-hmm.
So I almost wonder if sometimes the representation accommodates for, I don't know if it's apologizing, but when you say that a public might be able to access it like the chicken leg, you're apologizing for kitsch. I don't know if you care to comment on that.
I probably wouldn't call it kitsch necessarily, but I appreciate the idea that it was a sort of it seems like an easy thing, like a sort of engaging thing visually anyway, that people can see different things in it, and then I talk about it in a bit more maybe even stoic way at times. Where like the house you're referencing has a diametric projection and a trimetric, and then there's two parts that are in perspective, and then the rest is just elevation and the reconstruction of the Haas-Lilienthal house. But I like to talk about it, especially in a room of architects. I much prefer to talk about it in like very explicit as it can be, architectural terms. I avoid Venturi and topics like irony and all of that for very specific reasons. If this were an audience of, I don't know, like a collection of anybody but architects, I'd probably describe it differently, except for the parts that are the received histories. So talking about the Victorians and the Victorian houses and their relationship to the kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture of the 60s or the gay rights movement in the 80s, that's not an architectural disciplinary problem. It's a broader cultural context. So for me, like the fact that everybody sort of chuckles when you see that turret that's bigger than the house, like that's something that anybody can understand is sort of odd if pointed out. But I really prefer to position the work in this room in a way that is sort of pointed and focused on the architectural merits, or maybe even just the disciplinary merits.
I actually found your descriptions really very beautiful and very much aligned with the work you showed. And they were just as inventive as the work. In a way, I thought they had a lot of character. And I thought they specifically American character. And because to me, it feels like an American project that you're doing. American because, I can see, like, when you look at the first houses of Frank Lloyd Wright, I mean, he was taking the gable and the entrance and the gutter and the door and the back door and the bay window, and basically was manipulating and changing and studying the relationship of all of those one to another.
It's a very astute read. On the one hand, I can't overcome my Americanness, I suppose.
No, I didn't say it in a bad way.
But on the other, I really appreciate your comment. It means a lot to me. It's nice hearing those things. But it's also an astute read because the thing that went sort of unmentioned that I haven't really unpacked tonight is the Thenhaus series is a revisiting of what we presume to be quintessential sort of Americana. So that's where the received histories, even about the cabin, the farmhouse, and so forth, is part of a larger kind of thing that I'm up to. But it is very much about a kind of rereading, and this is where Venturi figures in again. But it is very much about a rereading of those kinds of domestic types, but through the lens of their quote-unquote received histories. So the one that's also done that I'm not showing yet is a ranch house, and there's a kind of argument about the receding front door and the kind of removal of the foundation, which was piers prior to World War II. Post World War II, during the war they used a lot of slab on grade. It was a military invention. So all of a sudden the houses appear more, kind of squinted. And anyway, so it's definitely a very American kind of revisiting. And then followed by a kind of reimagination of those types.
But I think your way of telling it really works well. Also with your associations of Dorothy and Psycho and the transformation into suddenly the farm animals that come out of the building. So I think it really works well. In my opinion, you don't need the Venturi association in this narrative.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Any other questions?
Thanks, Chloe.